Minus 20 degrees Celsius, a snowy night, stone walls, a wooden roof, and a pile of straw on the ground. No light, no heating, not even a blanket. This was the reality of a peasant in the Middle Ages. The lives of poor peasants in medieval Europe were incredibly difficult and simple, something we would find hard to imagine today. Winter months, in particular, meant battling not only the cold but also hunger, disease, and darkness. But people survived. They didn't just survive, they sustained their existence for generations. So tonight, we'll discover how poor peasants slept, kept warm, and survived on the coldest nights of the Middle Ages. If you managed to sleep, that's fine. But have you ever wondered? How do you sleep without freezing without a blanket? Tonight, we'll first look at the general structure of medieval village life. Then we'll examine the methods of house construction. After that, we'll understand how winter preparations were made. Finally, before falling asleep, we'll learn how people slept on those dark nights and what methods they used. But where do we begin? First, we need to understand that era. When we think of the Middle Ages, we usually picture magnificent castles, knights, and queens. However, the reality is that 90% of the population in the Middle Ages were farmers living in villages. These people didn't own land. They were serfs working on the lands of lords, barons, or church estates. Serfdom was a status between slaves and free peasants. A serf couldn't leave the land, but they couldn't be sold either. They were bound to it. A peasant would wake up at dawn. They had to go to the fields before sunrise, because daylight was limited and every minute was precious. Summer was harvest time, and winter was survival time. Field work stopped in the winter months, but other tasks continued. Gathering wood, feeding the animals, repairing roofs, grinding grain, baking bread. None of it stopped. Villages were generally small settlements, ranging from 20 to 50 households. Some villages were larger, but most were small communities. The center of the village usually consisted of a church, a mill, and the Lord's manor. The villagers' houses were scattered around the perimeter. Each family had a small garden, perhaps a few chickens, rarely a pig or a goat. Owning a cow was a great luxury. Village life was communal. Everyone knew each other. Neighbors helped each other. At harvest time, everyone worked in the fields. When winter came, everyone struggled to survive on their own. But they weren't entirely alone. Neighbors shared firewood, exchanged food, and looked after each other's children. The social structure was rigid. At the top was the king, below them the lords, below them the knights and clergy, and at the bottom the peasants. The peasants paid their taxes with their produce. Half or more of the harvested wheat went to the Lord. They were also obliged to work for free on the Lord's lands on certain days. This was called corvée labor. The peasant would work 3 days in their own field and 3 days in the Lord's field. The church also collected a tithe from everyone. That is, 1/11 of everything produced went to the church. This left very little for the peasants. Preparing for winter meant using these limited resources wisely. Now you might be wondering, why didn't people revolt under such harsh conditions? In fact, revolts did occur from time to time, but for most peasants, this order was divine. The church taught that everyone is born into and dies in a class determined by God. Being poor was a test, and they would be rewarded in the afterlife. This belief system was the strongest factor sustaining them. However, tonight our topic isn't philosophy or social structure. It's how they survived the winter. So how did peasants prepare for winter? Before answering this question, let's look at how their houses were built. In the Middle Ages, poor peasant houses were extremely simple. There was no concern for comfort, luxury, or aesthetics. The only purpose was shelter. Houses were usually single-roomed. All members of the family, and sometimes animals, lived in the same space. The house was small, approximately 5 meters long and 3 meters wide. The ceiling was low, not even 2 meters. Because materials were limited, a high ceiling would cause heat loss. The walls were made of a mixture of mud and straw over wooden frames. This was called a timber-framed house. They placed the wooden posts vertically. They would weave horizontal bars between the frames. Then they would spread a mortar mixture of mud, straw, animal dung, and clay over this frame. This mortar would solidify when it dried, forming a wall. The insulation was very poor, but better than nothing. In some areas, stone walls were also built, but stone was expensive and required labor. Most villagers only used stone for the foundation. The lower part of the walls was made of stone, and the upper part was made of wood and mud. In this way, the wall was protected from moisture. Roofs were made of thatch or straw. A thick layer of straw would not let water through, but the risk of fire was high. A fire in one house could burn down the whole village. Thatch roofs were also breeding grounds for pests. Mice, insects, and even birds lived on the roof. Windows were either non-existent or very small. There was no glass. Glass was only found in the houses of the wealthy and in churches. In village houses, windows were covered with wooden shutters. In winter, these shutters were kept closed because cold air would enter. But this meant that the inside was dark. Sunlight could not enter. The door was simple, a wooden board or a leather curtain. There was no lock because there was nothing to steal. When the door was opened, air would enter. Therefore, the door was kept closed as much as possible. There was no flooring on the ground. It was bare earth. Some families would pile straw, leaves, or grass on top. This provided both softness and some insulation. But over time, these materials would rot, smell, and attract pests. They needed to be replaced regularly. There was nothing inside that could be called furniture. Maybe a wooden table, maybe a stool, but no bed. Most families slept on the floor. They would pile straw in one corner and spread a piece of cloth or leather on top. That was their bed. So, how was such a primitive structure prepared for winter? The first step was repairing the walls. When autumn came, the walls were checked. Cracks were filled with a mixture of mud and straw, because in winter, the wind would enter through these cracks and all the heat in the house would escape. The roof was also checked. Missing or rotten pieces of straw were replaced. A solid roof had to withstand the weight of the snow. Otherwise, the roof could collapse. Door and window openings were sealed as tightly as possible. Pieces of cloth, pieces of leather, or even mud were used to plug the gaps. The goal was to prevent the wind from entering. The most important thing inside was the hearth. But the hearth wasn't like it is today. Medieval peasant houses didn't have modern fireplaces. There was a simple fire pit in the middle of the house. A pit was dug in the ground. Stones were placed around it, and a fire was lit in the center. Smoke rose through the roof. There was no chimney. This system was extremely inefficient. Smoke accumulated inside the house, burning the eyes and damaging the lungs. But there was no other option. The fire was used for both heating and cooking. In winter, this fire was never extinguished. It continued to burn throughout the night because it was difficult to light a fire again in the morning. There were no lighters. Sparks were produced by rubbing flint stones together, and those sparks were dropped onto dry grass to start the fire. This was a long and difficult process. Therefore, the fire was kept alive. Wood was precious. Cutting trees from the Lord's forests without permission was forbidden. The penalty was severe. Villagers obtained wood either by getting permission from the Lord or by collecting dead branches. In the autumn, every family tried to stockpile wood for the winter, but it was never enough. As winter dragged on, the wood ran out. Then animal dung, dry grass, or even straw were burned. These were smoky and smelled bad, but they provided heat. Now we've seen the houses, but was winter preparation limited only to the house? No, the real preparation was about stockpiling food, because in winter, field work stopped and no new food was produced. The more successful the harvest, the easier the winter would be. During the summer and autumn months, Families tried to accumulate as much food as they could. Grain was harvested, milled, and made into flour. The flour was stored in sacks. But mice were a big problem. Mice would get into the grain storage areas and consume large quantities of grain. That's why villagers valued cats. A cat could keep mice away. Vegetables were dried. Vegetables like onions, garlic, beets, and cabbage were stored in the ground. A pit was dug outside the house. The vegetables were placed there and covered with soil. The soil provided insulation and kept the vegetables from freezing. Meat was rare. Most villagers didn't have animals. Those who did, their animals were very valuable. Cows gave milk. Chickens gave eggs. Pigs provided fat. Slaughtering these animals was a last resort. However, if an animal fell ill or weakened in the middle of winter, it would be slaughtered. Preserving the meat after slaughter was difficult. There were no refrigerators. Meat was salted or smoked. Salting dried the meat and prevented bacterial growth. Smoking had a similar effect. With these methods, meat could last for months, but it would taste bad, and the amount of salt was unhealthy. Dairy products were also important. Milk, cheese, and butter were sources of protein. Milk spoiled quickly, but cheese lasted a long time. Villagers made simple cheeses and consumed them in winter. Another critical point in preparing for winter was clothing. But poor villagers had very limited clothing. Most families had 1 or 2 garments per person. These clothes were roughly made of wool or linen. There were no luxuries like scarves, gloves, or thick socks. Shoes were made of leather, but most villagers, who went barefoot in the summer, kept their shoes for winter. A thick cloak or a felt-like covering was the most valuable piece of clothing. This was worn when going outside to protect against the cold, but because the fabric was of poor quality, it was waterproof. A villager who got wet risked hypothermia. But even with all these preparations, how did they actually sleep on a freezing winter night? That's the real question. Because the house was cold, there were no beds, no blankets, just a fire, some straw, and body heat. Now let's pause and think about this. How do you sleep on a cold night without blankets? Maybe you've never thought about it. Maybe you're comfortably lying in your bed under your thick duvet right now. But for medieval peasants, that was a luxury. They fought for survival every night. Their sleep patterns were very different. Nowadays, we have one long sleep at night. In the Middle Ages, people slept in 2 stages. The first sleep began when darkness fell, around 7 or 8 in the evening, because there were no candles or oil lamps. There was nothing to do in the dark. The family would gather, perhaps say a short prayer, and everyone would sleep. The first sleep didn't last until morning. People would wake up around midnight. This nighttime awakening is quite normal. Historians call this the first sleep and the second sleep. What did people do when they woke up at midnight? Some would pray. Some would visit their neighbors. Some would chat with their spouses. Some would check the fire. After an hour or 2, they would go back to sleep. This second sleep would last until dawn. This sleep pattern has disappeared in the modern world, but it was very common in the Middle Ages. It was even considered natural, because the human body cannot remain motionless for long hours in the dark. Waking up at night to check the fire and ensure safety was a survival instinct. So how did they keep warm while sleeping? The first method was lighting a fire. A fire pit in the middle of the house would burn throughout the night, but the heat of the fire was limited. Only those closest to the fire would be warm. The corners of the house were like ice. Also, the fire was dangerous. If a spark fell on the straw, the house could burn down. Therefore, the fire had to be carefully controlled. The second method was body heat. Family members would huddle together to sleep. Mother, father, and children would sleep together in the same pile of straw. Body heat was shared to conserve warmth. This wasn't limited to just the family. Animals were also brought into the house. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens were kept inside. The animals' body heat helped heat the house. Yes, it wasn't hygienic. The smell was awful, but the temperature would increase by a few degrees, and that difference could save lives. The third method was layering clothes. Villagers didn't undress when they went to bed. They slept in all their clothes. If possible, an extra cloak, felt, or old sack would be placed over them. These weren't very comfortable, but they provided insulation. The fourth method was insulation from the floor. Straw, leaves, grass, and even animal hides were spread on the ground. These materials prevented direct contact with the cold earth. Lying on straw was better than lying on bare ground, though not gold. The fifth method was hot stones. Some families would heat stones over a fire during the day. At night, these hot stones were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. The stone would provide warmth for a few hours. This was a simple but effective method. Of course, not every family had access to this, as it was considered a luxury. The sixth method was hot food and drink. Drinking a hot soup or boiling water before bed would raise body temperature. But food was scarce in winter. Most nights, people went to bed hungry. A hungry body gets cold more quickly. This vicious cycle forced many villagers to endure it. The seventh method was movement. If someone got very cold at night, they would get up. They would walk around the fire for a few minutes, rub their hands, and lie down again. This was a temporary solution, but it prevented freezing. Method 8 was breath control. People would cover their mouths and noses with their hands or a piece of cloth. Warming the inhaled air reduced body heat loss. This method was especially used on very cold nights. Method 9 was communal sleeping. Sometimes more than one family would stay in the same house, especially in very harsh winters. Neighbors would pool their resources and spend the night together in the warmest house. 101 people would sleep in the same room. There was no privacy, but the chances of survival increased. But was all this enough? Most of the time, yes, but sometimes not. Many villagers froze to death in winter. The elderly, babies, and the sick were especially at risk. No one was surprised if a member of the family didn't wake up in the morning. Death was normal in the Middle Ages. Now we can ask a question. Why didn't they develop better methods? Why didn't they build thicker walls, chimney systems, wool blankets? The answer is simple. There were no resources, no knowledge. There was no technology, but most importantly, the social system wouldn't allow it. The villagers gave most of what they produced as taxes. What was left was barely enough to survive. There was no room for luxury. Furthermore, most villagers were illiterate. Knowledge was passed down orally, from father to son, from mother to daughter. Therefore, innovation spread very slowly. A method discovered in one region would reach another years later. The church also played a role. According to church teachings, worldly comfort was not important. What truly mattered was the afterlife. Suffering helped cleanse the soul. This belief prevented the villagers from trying to improve their lives. Now, perhaps your eyes are beginning to grow heavy. Perhaps you've imagined yourself in a cold medieval house, lying on the straw, watching the flickering light of a fire. The wind is howling outside. Snow is seeping through the roof. But you are warm, because you are in a modern bed, in a warm room, living a comfortable life. Perhaps you've already begun to fall asleep at this point. If so, you've completed your task, but we're not finished yet, because the most interesting part is yet to come. In winter, not only the cold, but also the darkness was a problem. In the modern world, electricity makes night as bright as day. But in the Middle Ages, darkness fell when the sun set. Candles were very expensive. Only the wealthy and churches could afford to use them. For peasants, the only source of light was fire. The light of a fire was weak and flickering. Darkness reigned in the corners of the house. This darkness created a psychological pressure. People couldn't see what was happening in the dark. Imaginary fears grew. Medieval people believed in supernatural powers. demons, devils, witches, ghosts. Night was the time when these creatures roamed. Villagers tried to protect themselves by praying and making pilgrimages. Darkness also created practical problems. What did they do when they needed to use the toilet? There were no toilets. There was a pit outside the house or a bucket inside. Going to the pit in the dark was dangerous. You could fall and get injured. So most people waited until morning. When they woke up at night, there was nothing else to do. No books, no games, no entertainment, just darkness and silence. So people tried to go back to sleep. Sleep was the only escape. But sleep didn't always come easily. Hunger, cold, pain made it difficult to sleep. The crying of babies, the sounds of animals, the howling of the wind. There was no such thing as silence. But exhaustion eventually won, and people fell asleep. With the dawn, the village awoke. The first thing to do was revive the fire. The fire was rekindled by adding dry grass and wood to the embers remaining in the ashes. Then water was brought, a simple breakfast was eaten, and work began. Work in winter was different from summer. There was no field work, but there was maintenance work, roof repair, barn cleaning, wood gathering, grain grinding. Women spun, knitted, and cooked. Men went out to feed the animals. Children helped too. Even a 3-year-old could do small tasks. A simple lunch was eaten: bread, soup, some vegetables. Meat was rare. A simple dinner followed, and when night came, the same routine returned: fire, darkness, cold, sleep. This monotonous life continued for 45 months of winter. January and February were the hardest months, because by then food supplies would begin to run out, wood would decrease, and illnesses would increase: flu, pneumonia, diarrhea. These illnesses were much more deadly in winter. There was no doctor in the village. Only women healers tried to treat illnesses with medicinal herbs. But for most diseases, there was no cure. A child with a high fever could die within days. An old man could not recover from a coughing fit. A mother giving birth could lose her life from complications. Death was always near. Every peasant knew and accepted this. According to church teachings, death was not frightening. On the contrary, passage to heaven was a gift. This belief gave people comfort. Perhaps we understand better now. Being a poor peasant in the Middle Ages was unimaginably difficult today. They struggled to survive every day. In winter, this struggle was twice as difficult, but people survived. They lived like this for generations. So why did they accept such harsh conditions? Why didn't they demand something better? There are 3 reasons. First, they didn't know of any other life. Their grandfathers had lived like this. Their fathers had lived like this. They themselves would live like this. They couldn't imagine an alternative. Second, the social system was very rigid. A serf could not leave the land. Peasants who tried to escape were caught and punished. There was no mobility. You remained in the class you were born into. Third, religion was very powerful. According to church teachings, this world was temporary and unimportant. What truly mattered was the afterlife. Poverty and suffering helped purify the soul. It was said that for the rich, entering paradise was harder than a camel passing through the eye of a needle. These teachings gave the peasants patience and solace. But over time, the system began to crumble. In the 14th century, great rebellions broke out in Europe. The plague epidemic reduced the population, and peasants gained more power. Some lords were forced to offer better conditions to the peasants. But this change was slow and took centuries. The end of the Middle Ages came in the 15th century. The Renaissance, the invention of the printing press, the discovery of America, all these changed the world. But the lives of the peasants did not improve immediately. Even in the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, living conditions in rural areas did not change much. Real change came with the Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 18th century, machines were invented. Factories opened. People migrated from villages to cities. A new class was born, the working class. Their lives were also difficult, but at least it was a different kind of difficulty. Heating, lighting, and nutrition gradually improved. Today, we are far from those dark days. Our homes are heated, our beds are soft, our blankets are warm, and our food is in the refrigerator. Water flows from the taps. Electricity illuminates every room. All of this was unimaginable for a medieval peasant. But sometimes we need to stop and think. Just a few centuries ago, our ancestors struggled to survive in those dark houses on those cold nights. It is thanks to their struggle and resilience that we are here today. Perhaps we should show them some respect. Now let's delve a little deeper. Winter wasn't just about physical hardships. It was also about psychological hardships. In modern terms, we call this seasonal depression. When sunlight decreases, human psychology is negatively affected. Medieval peasants experienced this too, but it didn't have a name. There was little to do during the long, dark days of winter. Social interaction was limited, because going outside in the cold was difficult, visiting neighbors was risky, and group activities were few. People stayed indoors and became isolated. This loneliness and monotony negatively impacted mental health. Some people became more withdrawn. Some became irritable and restless. Family conflicts increased because living together in the same cramped space for weeks created tension. The church became even more important during this period. Going to church on Sundays was a social activity. People gathered there, prayed, and saw each other. Sermons offered hope and comfort. The church was also a center of knowledge. Priests would announce news, announcements would be made, and the community would gather. This psychological support made winter bearable. Some villages had winter traditions. The Christmas period was the most important time. It offered a ray of hope during the darkest days of the year. Special services were held in the church. Small celebrations were organized in homes. Of course, for poor villagers, these celebrations were very modest. Perhaps a slightly better meal, perhaps a song, perhaps a short dance, but it still created a moment of joy. Storytelling was also important. On long winter nights, families would gather, and elders would tell stories to the young. Legends, fairy tales, religious stories. These stories both entertained and passed on values and traditions. A child grows up listening to these stories. They tell them to their own children. There was also music. Simple instruments, a flute, drum, a stringed instrument similar to a rebab. On special days, people would gather, sing songs, and dance. These moments added color to life. But in winter, such activities were rare. Silence and darkness mostly prevailed. Now let's touch on another important point: hygiene. By modern standards, medieval peasants had virtually no concept of hygiene. Bathing was very rare, because heating water required wood, and wood was precious. Also, getting wet and cold weather brought illness. Therefore, people didn't wash for months. Clothes weren't washed either. A garment would be worn the same way for months, even years. Sweat, dirt, and body odor would accumulate. But nobody was bothered, because everyone was in the same situation. The smell was normal. There was no such thing as dental hygiene. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste. Teeth decayed and fell out. Bad breath was common. Painful teeth were extracted, but without anesthesia. Pain was endured, but there was no alternative. Hair was also neglected. There weren't even combs. In most families, hair was tangled and infested with lice. Lice were a very common problem. Every villager had lice in their hair and fleas on their clothes. These insects would bite them while they slept at night. Itching, redness, infection, these were all part of daily life. The inside of the houses wasn't hygienic either. The straw and grass on the floor would rot, attracting insects. Animal droppings, food scraps, and garbage would accumulate. Rats and mice were common. This environment created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Infectious diseases like plague, cholera, and typhus spread rapidly. If one person fell ill, the entire family, even the entire village, could be affected. Because people lived so close together, isolation was impossible. In the 14th century, it ravaged continental Europe. A third of the population died. Villages were wiped off the map. There was nowhere to bury the corpses. After this catastrophe, European society was never the same. The serfdom system collapsed because the number of workers decreased, and those who survived gained more bargaining power. But even before the plague, life was very difficult. The average life expectancy was very short. 40 was considered old age. Most people died in their 30s. Infant mortality was very high. 1 in 3 babies born died before the age of 1. Mothers gave birth to an average of 67 children, but only 2 or 3 reached adulthood. This high mortality rate shaped the psychology of society. People accepted death. Death was not an end, but a transition. Funeral ceremonies were simple. The body was wrapped in cloth, placed in an earthen pit, and prayers were recited. There were no gravestones, only a simple cross or stone. The mourning period was short because life had to go on. Those who survived had to continue working. Even if there was emotional pain, it was not shown. Men were not expected to shed tears. Emotional support was limited. Everyone had to fend for themselves. Women's lives were especially difficult. In medieval society, women were considered subordinate to men. They were married off at a young age. A girl could marry at the age of 13 or 14. Marriage wasn't a matter of love. It was an agreement between families. 2 families would come together and match their children. After marriage, the woman's role was to bear children and manage the household. Childbirth was a very risky process. Every birth meant a potential death. Home births were performed with the help of a midwife. If complications arose, there was no remedy. Bleeding, infection, thousands of women lost their lives during childbirth. Surviving the winter was even more difficult for a pregnant woman. Malnutrition, cold, lack of hygiene. A healthy baby was like a miracle. The newborn also had to withstand difficult conditions. If there was no breast milk or it was insufficient, the baby would quickly become ill. Women were also responsible for all the housework: cooking, carrying water, grinding grain, baking bread, sewing clothes, and childcare. All of these were their duties. They also worked in the fields. They had no right to rest. Even if they were sick, they had to do the work because the family depended on their labor. If a woman didn't work, the household wouldn't function. The children's lives were different. The concept of childhood hardly existed. Children were seen as miniature adults. They started working from the age of 6 to 5. They contributed to the family's livelihood. Playing and going to school were luxuries. Children also got cold in winter. Their small bodies were more sensitive to the cold. Many children fell ill in the winter months and did not recover. Mothers did their best, but it was often not enough. There were no toys. Children invented games with materials they found in nature. A wooden doll, a game made of stones. Their imaginations developed because there was no other entertainment. Education was only available to a very small number of children. There were church schools, but only the children of the wealthy could attend. Peasant children did not learn to read and write. Knowledge was passed down orally, through tradition. Now let's look a little more deeply at the methods of food preparation. Cooking in winter was also a difficult task. Bread was the staple food, but making bread was a lengthy process. The grain had to be milled first. There was a mill in the village, but it was run by the Lord's men who charged a fee for its use. The villagers gave a portion of their grain as mill tax. The milled flour was brought home and mixed with yeast. The yeast was naturally taken from leavened dough. The dough was kneaded, left to rest, and baked. There were no ovens. Bread was baked in the hearth of the house, on hot stones, or under hot ashes. Bread baked this way was hard and dry, but it didn't spoil for a long time. Soup was the most common dish. Vegetables, grains, and sometimes a piece of meat were boiled in a cauldron. This soup would remain in the same cauldron for days. A little more ingredients would be added each day. Thus, there was always something to eat. Cooking meat was a rare luxury. If an animal was slaughtered, its meat had to be consumed immediately because it would spoil. The villagers would gather and share the meat. This was an example of solidarity. If a villager slaughtered an animal, he would share it with his neighbors, because in the future he too would receive from others. Fish was important in some regions. Fishing was practiced in villages near rivers or lakes. Fish was a source of protein, and according to church rules, fish could be eaten instead of meat on fasting days. Salted fish lasted a long time. Vegetables were limited. Cabbage, onions, beets, carrots. These were vegetables that could survive the winter. Green leafy vegetables were unavailable in winter. Vitamin deficiencies were common and led to illnesses. Fruit was very rare. Apples and pears grew in some regions. Dried fruits were a valuable food source in winter, but most villagers did not have access to fruit. Drinks consisted of water, milk, and beer. Water was the cheapest, but not always safe. Dirty water carried disease, so beer was preferred. Beer was made by boiling, killing bacteria, and making it a safe drink. It was also nutritious. Even children would drink lightly alcoholic beer. Milk was important but spoiled quickly. Yogurt and cheese lasted longer. Butter was also valuable. It was used both in cooking and applied to the skin to protect it in cold weather. Meal times were irregular. A snack would be eaten early in the morning. The main meal would be at noon. A light meal would be consumed in the evening. But in winter, when food was scarce, the number of meals decreased. Some days, only one meal was eaten. Periods of famine occurred. Food could run out after a bad harvest or at the end of a long winter. At those times, people would eat grass, bark, or even soil. Deaths from starvation occurred. Historical records speak of years of famine. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives to starvation. The church tried to help during these times. Monasteries distributed soup to the poor, but these aids were insufficient. Too many people, too few resources. Now let's talk about another challenge: diseases. In the Middle Ages, medicine was at a primitive level. The causes of diseases were unknown. Concepts of infection, bacteria, and viruses did not exist. Diseases were seen as the result of bad weather, bad smells, or the wrath of the gods. Treatment methods were generally ineffective. Medicinal herbs were used. Some actually worked. For example, willow bark had a pain-relieving effect. Garlic helped against infections. Honey, when applied to wounds, accelerated healing. But many treatments were based on superstition. Wearing amulets, reciting prayers, begging saints. These methods provided psychological comfort, but did not cure the physical illness. A sick peasant either recovered or died. It was a matter of chance. Those with strong immune systems survived. The weak succumbed. In winter, colds, flu, and pneumonia were common. Cold, damp environments, malnutrition, crowded living conditions. All these factors spread disease. Cough, fever, chills. These symptoms could be fatal. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable groups. Their immune systems were weak. An illness could rapidly worsen. The eldest member of a family could be healthy at the beginning of winter and dead by the end. The disabled and the sick were a burden on society. While it may seem cruel, it was true. If a villager couldn't work, they became a burden to their family. Resources were limited. Those who were unproductive weren't given priority, but they weren't completely abandoned either. Family ties were strong. A mother wouldn't abandon her sick child. A son would look after his elderly father. Social solidarity alleviated some difficulties. Neighbors helped each other. If someone's house burned down, the village would help rebuild. If someone's animal died, others would share some food. This solidarity made survival possible. The church offered a support system. Nuns cared for the sick and helped the poor. Monasteries served as refuges. In difficult times, people would go to the monastery for help. However, the church was also a source of oppression. The concept of sin was very strong. Every bad event was seen as punishment for a sin. A sick person was considered a sinner. This created an additional psychological burden. Confession was mandatory. Everyone had to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year. Otherwise, they would be excommunicated. Excommunication was a terrible punishment. It meant being ostracized from society. No one would speak to or help someone who had been excommunicated. Superstitions were widespread. Bad luck, black cats, broken mirrors, bad dreams, all were considered harbingers of disaster. The villagers held these beliefs to a firm grip. Accusations of witchcraft were common. Someone would be blamed, especially when something bad happened. A bad harvest, animal deaths, disease outbreaks. There had to be a cause, and that cause was usually attributed to a witch. Innocent people were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and sometimes burned at the stake. Fear ruled society. Darkness, unknown death. All of this was part of daily life. People had learned to live with fear. But alongside fear, there was also hope. Spring would come. The sun would warm again. Seeds would be sown. The harvest would be made. Life would go on. This hope kept people going. Towards the end of winter, everyone awaited spring. The first snowdrops, the first sprouts. These were harbingers of good news. Winter was ending. Life was awakening again. With the arrival of March, field work began. The soil was plowed, seeds were sown. Everyone was in the fields, because good planting meant a good harvest, and a good harvest meant the coming winter would pass. Spring was also a time for cleansing. Houses were aired out, old straw inside was thrown away, and new straw was laid down. Clothes were washed and dried outside, cleaned in the sun. But spring didn't just bring hope, it also brought danger. Because the dirt, garbage, and waste accumulated during the winter became a source of disease. When winter ended, epidemics began. Infections similar to the flu, called spring illnesses, spread. Also, people who were malnourished during the winter had weak immune systems. Even if the weather warmed up in spring, the body was still vulnerable. This transition period was critical. Most villagers would survive the winter, but get sick in the spring. Still, the arrival of spring was a great relief. There was no longer a need to fight the cold. Darkness no longer fell early. The threat of hunger was less. Life became colorful again. Now let's go back a little and look at the interior arrangement of the houses in more detail. There were very few furnishings inside the houses. The houses of the wealthy had chests, tables, and stools. But the houses of poor villagers did not have these. Perhaps a wooden table, perhaps a chest. That's all. The chest was very important because valuable items were kept there. A few clothes, perhaps some grain, perhaps a small knife. The chest was locked because even if guests came, it was necessary not to trust it. In times of famine, people would become desperate and start stealing. Kitchen utensils were very simple. There was no cauldron, maybe a pot, a few wooden spoons, or plates. Food was eaten directly from the cauldron, or a piece of bread served as a plate. Food was placed on it and eaten with the bread. There were no forks. The fork originated in Italy towards the end of the Middle Ages and spread over the centuries. Peasants ate with their hands. Spoons existed, but were usually made of wood. The knife was important. Every man carried a knife. This knife was used both for eating and for daily tasks, cutting wood, cutting rope, working with leather. The knife was multifunctional. Light sources were very limited. The wealthy used candles, but candles were expensive. They were made of beeswax or tallow. For peasants, this was a luxury. They either used the light of a fire or made simple lamps of a mixture of wick and oil. But these lamps also smoky and gave off weak light. Darkness was an integral part of medieval life. When the sun set, the world was plunged into darkness. Even in cities, the streets were dark. In villages, there were no street lights at all. If a peasant went out at night, he had to carry a torch. This darkness was both a physical and psychological burden. People feared the dark because dangers lurked there. Wild animals, bandits, evil spirits. All these things emerged at night. Wolf packs were a real danger in some areas, especially during very harsh winters. They would approach villages driven by hunger. They would attack sheep, goats, and sometimes even people. Villagers lived in fear. Bandits were also common. They hid in the forests, robbing travelers. They raided villages, taking food and valuables. There was no force to protect themselves. The Lord had soldiers, but they only protected the Lord's property. Villagers had to fend for themselves. Some villages built fences or walls for protection, but this was expensive and time-consuming. Most villages were defenseless. In case of an attack, everyone would flee and hide in the forest. Wars also affected the villagers. In the Middle Ages, wars broke out constantly. Lords attacked each other. Kings fought for land. In these wars, villagers were conscripted into the army. They had to go, even if they didn't want to. War meant death. Uneducated and unarmed villagers were easy targets on the battlefield. Many did not return. The families they left behind were devastated. It was very difficult for a family to survive without a male. The war also struck the villages. Everything was looted in the places the armies passed through. Fields were burned, houses were destroyed, and livestock were stolen. For peasants, the outcome of war was the same regardless of who won: destruction. Therefore, peasants hated wars, but couldn't voice their opinions because the system wouldn't listen. They were simply people who worked the land, paid taxes, and were forced to remain silent. However, rebellion sometimes broke out. The peasant revolt in 14th century England is famous. The peasants, fed up with excessive taxes and mistreatment, armed themselves and rose up against the lords. Initially, they were successful, but eventually, they were suppressed. The leaders were executed, and the rebels were punished. This revolt showed something. Even though the peasants were oppressed and silenced, an anger was building up inside them, and from time to time, this anger would erupt, resulting in bloodshed. Similar revolts occurred in France. The Jacquerie Revolt was an uprising involving thousands of peasants. They stormed the castles of the nobles and burned their manors. But this revolt was also brutally suppressed. None of these revolts destroyed the system, but they created cracks within it. The lords could no longer completely ignore the peasants. Small improvements began to be made. Now let's touch on another subject: religious life. The church was central to medieval life. Every village had a church, a small, simple stone building, but it was a sacred place for the villagers. Everyone went to church on Sundays. It was mandatory. Those who didn't go were considered to have sinned. The priest would read prayers and preach. The sermons were in Latin. The villagers didn't understand Latin, but it didn't matter. What mattered was being there. The church also served as a social center. After the service, people would gather in the churchyard, talk, and exchange messages. This was the only social activity of the week. Religious holidays were important: Christmas, Easter, All Saints' Day. On these days, work was forbidden. People would rest, pray, and have some fun. Special feasts were held in the church. Sometimes food was distributed. There were also pilgrimages. Pious villagers would travel to distant places to visit the tomb of a saint. This was both a religious duty and an adventure. Most villagers never left their villages throughout their lives, but those who went on pilgrimage saw other cities and met other people. But pilgrimage was a luxury. Most villagers had neither the time nor the money. They stayed in their villages, living in their own little worlds. Religion was also a form of control. The church told people what was right and what was wrong. The concept of sin encompassed everything. Sex was a sin outside of marriage. Greed was a sin. Anger was a sin. Sloth was a sin. Even thought could be a sin. People were constantly afraid of sinning because sin meant hell. The descriptions of hell were very vivid: fire, sulfur, demons, eternal torment. Horrifying scenes of hell were painted on the church walls. These images conveyed a clear message to the illiterate villagers. This is the consequence of sinning. Heaven, on the other hand, promised eternal happiness, being with God, liberation from suffering, and peace. This promise comforted people. No matter how difficult life was, they would be rewarded in the afterlife. This belief system held society together. It made people obedient because rebellion was a sin. Opposing the system meant opposing God. Therefore, the villagers accepted their fate and suffered silently. But not everyone was so devout. Some people had skeptical thoughts. Some noticed the hypocrisy of the church. Priests preached about poverty while living in luxury. The church owned rich lands while the villagers starved. These contradictions did not escape the notice of some. However, these thoughts could not be voiced aloud because criticizing the church was a crime of heresy. Heretics were burned at the stake. Therefore, everyone showed their faith. What they thought inside didn't matter. Now it's midnight. Perhaps your eyes are already closed. Perhaps you find yourself in that dark house of the Middle Ages. You lie on a straw bed, watching the last embers of the fire. The wind is blowing outside. You can hear the sound of snow falling from the roof. But you are warm because your family is with you. You share body heat. Your eyes grow heavy. Sleep comes first. Work awaits in the morning. Working in the fields, gathering firewood, feeding the animals. But now there is only sleep. A deep, dark, silent sleep. And perhaps you too are beginning to drift into that sleep. In your modern bed, in your warm room, in your comfortable life. You have contemplated the pain, fear, and hardship of the Middle Ages, and now you can sleep peacefully. Because those days are behind us. Medieval peasants faced incredible hardships. They struggled with hunger and disease in freezing winters and dark nights, but they survived. They endured for generations. It is thanks to their struggle and resilience that we are here today. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: humans have incredible adaptable abilities. They find ways to survive even in the harshest conditions. Body heat, hay, sleeping together, simple but effective solutions. Today, we don't experience those hardships. We have warmth, light, and plenty of food. All of these are miracles of the modern age. But sometimes we should stop and think, what did our ancestors endure? And perhaps we should be a little grateful. Now breathe. Take a deep breath. Bury yourself in your pillow. Pull your blanket over you. And I want you to know that this story being told to you tonight is not just a story. It was the real lives of real people. They, just like you, loved, laughed, cried, hoped, feared, struggled, and slept every night. Just like you're doing now. Your eyes are closing. Your thoughts are blurring. The dark house of the Middle Ages recedes. You return to your own world. Your peaceful, safe, warm world. And perhaps you will remember what was told to you when you wake up tomorrow. Perhaps you won't. Either way, it doesn't matter. Because the main task is complete. We have both informed you and prepared you for sleep. The story of the medieval peasants is over, but your story continues. Tomorrow is a new day, new opportunities, new hopes. Now just sleep. A deep sleep, a restful breath, and perhaps in your dreams you will see those dark houses, those straw beds, those struggling people. Perhaps you won't. It doesn't matter. Tonight we told you how poor peasants slept during the freezing winters of the Middle Ages. I hope it was both educational and comforting. In the next video, we will explore another historical mystery. Until then, good night, sweet dreams, peaceful sleep, and remember that no matter how difficult it is, humanity always finds its way. Just like those peasants, just like you.